All right, so I'm going to give you your next notes. This is going to be on a new unit, really Unit 4. This is going to be on genetics. And we continue to move through and look at and try to understand how the characteristics of a living thing help define it. And so far, we've looked at energy, obtain and use energy. We've looked at cells, the basic unit of all living things. And we just looked at cell division. So now we're going to look at genetics. And if you think about genetics, genetics helps many things actually, but the main one that it helps accomplish is the universal genetic code. Let me see if I can add this. Universal genetic code. So it gives a way for organisms to pass on their traits to their offspring. And and we look at genetics, it's the science of how traits are passed from one generation to the other. So in this unit, we're going to look at how our traits passed on. How can we figure out what are the likelihoods of an organism getting these different possibilities for a trait? And how can we make little maps that show that? How can we look at mutations that may affect that, and so on? So this is just kind of our introduction. In genetics, if you remember this universal genetic code, it's accomplished, this passing on of traits, it's accomplished by DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. It's one of the 4 macromolecules. It's a nucleic acid, right? So if I put that in there, nucleic acid. And like in anything else in biology, everything is like little building blocks. You put these two together and they build something else. And macromolecules make more complex things like DNA and so on, right? And the father of genetics, though, is a gentleman named Gregor Mendel. And he's the one that really got the ideas flowing. And he did his work way before it was ever recognized. And he was a monk, lived in Austria. And when he wasn't praying and doing other things that monks do, he had a lot of free time. And he liked science and math. And he liked to garden. So he decided that he was going to use his new math that he just learned, data and statistics, and apply it to his garden. So he started keeping track of pea plants because he noticed that when he planted pea plants, and what he did was he saved them and he did things to pea plants to see how he could change them. And then he would get data from that. So he knew how they were reproducing. And he would take a little brush and he would take the pollen and take it from one plant, a male plant, and put it on a female plant and see how those plants turned out. And he looked at different characteristics like leaf color, the type of the seed, and lots of different things. And he took some data. And he was really the person that really started looking at and realizing that these traits aren't random that we receive, that they're actually predictable. We can make predictions on what an offspring is going to look like by what the parents, their traits, right? And other mathematical ideas come into this that he was able to figure out. So he was, not a modern person, but just using the basics of what he had at that time, he was able to do an amazing thing in genetics. And he came up with some main ideas, and one of them is that our traits are made up of alleles. An allele is just all the possibilities for a trait. And they use a letter to express it. But that's not really what's happening. But it helps organize it. And so if he did round peas. One of the traits he looked at was round peas. And another one was wrinkled. And he would just give it a letter. Okay. Just say wrinkle. And so he'd call round R. And this helped him keep track of what was going on. And he'd call wrinkle W. Okay, and that's just an allele. So um, many traits are determined by two alleles, two or more alleles. But the ones we're going to use to help us understand genetics are traits that are one of two possibilities because it helps uh, better understand it initially. But there are traits that have many alleles, like blood type is one, eye color is another one, and there's many. But to understand genetics at first, we're going to look at traits that have two alleles, one allele or the other. And so all traits are made up of alleles, and they're just all the possibilities for a trait. So if you have uh, there's something called Darwin's ear point. You either have the ear point or you don't, and then that might be big D or little d. We're going to talk about the next one here, and that's the principle of dominance. So for each set of alleles, one allele is dominant and one is recessive. There's lots of different little traits. Tongue rolling is one of them, and some people can roll their tongue and some people cannot. And often a better way, like you see this round is an R and a wrinkle is W, different letters. Uh, that's often not what they do. Like if they would use the dominant would be capital letter. So if we were going to say uh, for tongue rolling, it might be a capital R. But if you can't roll your tongue, it would be lowercase r. Okay. And then we could say, depending on what the trait the person has and other things that we know, we can try to figure out or make a prediction of what alleles they have or the possibility of alleles that they have for that trait. Okay. So that's that. So the principle of dominance. In any two alleles or more alleles, for a trait, some alleles are dominant and some are not. Now, again, we're going to talk a little bit later. There are some that blend, that one isn't dominant over the other, and that causes the trait to blend. And they used to think that, actually, that's how we got traits. And if your one parent had black hair and the other parent had blonde hair, you'd have between, like a brown hair. But they realized that that wasn't true just by simple observation. But so that's principle of dominance. For any trait, the possible alleles, one is going to be dominant and the other one's recessive. And what that means, dominant, it means so if you have two alleles, and for your tongue, if you have an R, capital R and a little r, that means if you have the dominant one, that's the trait you have. Even though this trait is there, the lowercase r, which means tongue, you can't roll your tongue, you're still going to, if you have one dominant allele, that gives you the tongue rolling or that trait. The only way you could ever have the recessive is if you have two of those alleles. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. We'll learn these things. This is just an introduction. So that's that one. The law of segregation, though, says you get one allele for each trait from your parents. So if you remember, we talked about meiosis. Okay. So meiosis, that's how a sperm and an egg is produced. And if you also remember, both of these have 23 chromosomes. 23. And that's half the number. Okay. Normally, any cell that hasn't undergone mitosis has 46 chromosomes. And that means you have 2 chromosomes for each possibility. So there's 23 pairs, which gives you 46. During meiosis, it breaks it down and you have 1 chromosome left of that pair. And that means, this is this law of segregation, so whenever a sperm or an egg are made, you only get one of the alleles you had. So if you're a tongue roller and this is what you have, a capital R or a lowercase r, when a sperm is made, you're either going to get the capital R or you're going to get the lowercase r. Like that. You only get one allele, and it's just random, as we talked about in class. So that's the law of segregation. And then it's important to understand also that alleles can be several different things. Okay, they can be homozygous, which means you have the same alleles in a pair. And this is just vocabulary because you're going to see these terms: homozygous, heterozygous. So homozygous means you have the same alleles, and they can be capital letter. And these are just A, just refers to the allele itself, and then recessive. So if you have homozygous, capital A, that means it's homozygous. I'm just going to initial it, homozygous dominant. If you have the other one, two lowercase a's, that means homozygous recessive. And you're going to see this. So we're going to talk more and more about this because you're going to get problems you have to figure out. And it's not going to give you the alleles, it's just going to tell you what they are. So they're homozygous dominant. That means two capital or two dominant alleles in the pair that they have. Okay, there's a way to figure that out, actually. We'll talk more about that later. So then there's heterozygous. That means you have different alleles in a pair. So if it was A, you'd have a capital A and a lowercase a. So you think about this. So if you're homozygous dominant and you only give one allele out, it doesn't matter here because you're going to give either a capital A or a capital A. So it doesn't matter. You're always going to give the same one. But here, and the same thing here, you're going to lowercase a, or the two dominant alleles. You're always going to give a dominant allele away. So that trait is going to get passed down. It's all, and as long as your offspring keeps giving that away, that trait will remain. They will continue to pass that down. But then heterozygous, this mixes it up a little bit because during this meiosis and the formation of sperm and egg, they can give a capital A or they can give a lowercase a. Okay. And we see, like we kind of talked about this in class, how sometimes, a child looks just like their parent, and sometimes they don't. Because sometimes the reason they don't is sometimes they give an allele or part of something for a trait. They give the one away that's not being expressed because it's paired with a dominant. But then when it's by itself, and if this recessive allele in the egg meets a recessive allele from the sperm, then it gives a new trait that's not being expressed in the parent. Okay, so that's that, heterozygous. And then two things to remember as well, and we'll be done here. This should look different. For some reason I put it on here, but we won't worry about it. So traits can be understood as a genotype or a phenotype. So genotype is talking about the inward form of alleles. So genotype would be capital A, homozygous dominant. Another genotype would be homozygous recessive. And another one, that's probably it for the homozygous. And then heterozygous would be this. Those are all genotypes. And then these letters are arbitrary. You can make them what you want for a trait. And usually it's best, like we're going to look at widow's peak, it has something to do with the trait. In the reality of all this, they have different ways to do this. But to learn genetics, this is really the best way to do it. Just makes it plain, because it can get confusing with things called wild types and such. But yes, okay. So that is genotype. It's just an expression. It says which alleles for that trait that the individual has. And then phenotype is the trait, okay, the outward physical appearance. So maybe it means that they have a Darwin's ear point. Or maybe it means they have a widow's peak. And we'll talk about what that is, because we're going to do this in class. So widow's peak. Or they have a straight hairline. Okay, and there's another one. Bent little finger is a trait everybody either has or doesn't. You can also have tongue rolling as one, so that either they can roll their tongue or they can't. Blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, that's a phenotype. But then also, for all those phenotypes, there's also a genotype that is either homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. So that's kind of our introductory notes for genetics. Make sure you've added to your notes. You've annotated it. Bring it to class. Show it to me for credit. and we're going to start working on genetics. This is a pretty fun unit. I'm going to try to attach a video that will help you even understand some of these laws a little bit more. And there's nothing to do other than to watch the video. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon.